Picture this. It's the spring of 1801, and a small group of heavily intoxicated military officers literally breaks into a palace in St. Petersburg and strangles Tsar Paul I to death. It's a shocking, incredibly brutal end to his reign. But, as the French writer Madame de Staël so sharply pointed out, in Russia, the government is autocracy tempered by assassination. And honestly, that dramatic event is the perfect jumping-off point for a whole discussion today. We're looking at a century that was essentially a giant, violent pendulum, swinging wildly back and forth between the genuine hope for reform and the harsh, crushing reality of repression.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the shadow of Napoleon to unpack exactly how Russia's really violent, traumatic encounters with the West triggered these massive, panicked reactions from its Tsars. Let's get right into it and see how a series of existential external threats fundamentally rewired a massive empire from the inside out.
Here's our roadmap for this super dense chunk of history. We're going to kick things off with the invasion and reaction of 1812. Then, we'll dive into the explosive Decembrist uprising, see exactly how that chaos birthed the first police state, explore the fascinating birth of the intelligentsia, and wrap up with Russia taking on the role of the policeman of Europe. Section 1. Invasion and Reaction. The Existential Threat of 1812.
So, Tsar Alexander I had actually flirted with Enlightenment ideas early on in his reign, but that completely changed when a massive ideological showdown brought Napoleon's forces quite literally to Russia's doorstep. 600,000. That is the number of soldiers in Napoleon's Grande Armée that crossed into Russian territory in June of 1812. To put that into perspective, it was the largest army ever assembled up to that point in history. Napoleon was looking for a quick, devastating knockout blow to force Russia to its knees. But the Russians totally flipped the script. They didn't fight him head-on. Instead, they kept retreating, drawing the French deeper and deeper into a massive, scorched earth trap, all the way to a completely burned-out, abandoned Moscow. And the result? Barely 10% of that enormous invasion force actually made it back alive. Between the absolutely brutal -30-degree winter, rampant starvation, and relentless guerrilla attacks, the Grande Armée was essentially wiped off the map.
Now talk about historical irony. Alexander I chased Napoleon all the way back to Paris, but that march across Europe completely transformed the Russian military elite. These noblemen fought side by side with resilient Russian peasant soldiers, and being in the West made them realize just how backwards their own country really was. So, they returned home carrying a highly dangerous import, liberal, democratic ideas. They became painfully aware that their homeland was basically stuck in a prehistoric past of serfdom and slavery. Section 2. The Decembrist Uprising. The pendulum swings to chaos. Those reformist officers didn't just forget what they saw. They started forming secret circles, eventually deciding they couldn't just sit around and wait for the Tsar to hand down gradual changes. By 1824, a guy named Colonel Pavel Pestel drafts this radically ambitious manifesto, calling for a republic and the total abolition of serfdom. Then, boom, November 1825. Alexander I suddenly dies of typhus. Nobody really knows who is supposed to take the throne, causing massive confusion. On December 12th, Nicholas I steps up and says he's taking power. Just 2 days later, the mutineers make their move. 3,000 troops march right into Senate Square in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution. But they were really poorly organized, and Nicholas did not hesitate. He ordered his loyal troops to fire directly into the crowd, gunning down 60 soldiers right there in the street.
The whole uprising was completely crushed, and the ringleaders were sentenced to death by hanging. But when the trapdoors dropped, the ropes actually snapped for 3 of the condemned men. They fell into the ditch below, heavy, bruised, but very much alive. One of them famously yelled out, "What a wretched country, they don't even know how to hang properly." It's a darkly funny moment, sure, but it really marked the absolute traumatic end of any liberal reform in Russia for an entire generation.
Part 3. The First Police State. Paralyzed by the fear of revolution.
The new Tsar, Nicholas I, was this incredibly strict, uncompromising military man, and his entire reign was completely driven by his deep, deep insecurity over that Decembrist revolt. So what does he do? He establishes the Third Department. This was a massive, totally unprecedented network of gendarmes and spies. We're talking opening people's mail, acting on anonymous tips, and relentlessly hunting down anyone even suspected of being a revolutionary. Nicholas essentially built a fortress of security forces around himself, completely terrified that foreign Jacobin ideas were going to infect Russia. But he couldn't just use force. He needed an ideological shield to fight off those Western concepts. Enter his Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov. In 1833, Uvarov rolls out a strict new state doctrine: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This was literally engineered to be the Russian antidote to the French Revolution's motto of liberty, equality, fraternity. It heavily pushed this myth that everyday Russians were uniquely, almost spiritually devoted to the church and the Tsar, using that idea to totally insulate the population from any sort of democratic challenge. Section 4. Birth of the Intellectuality, the Literary Resistance. So if you're an educated person in Russia, you are now completely cut off from any actual political power by this intense police state. So what do? You turn inward. Literature literally becomes the primary battleground. And this is exactly where we get the 19th century origin of uniquely Russian concept, the intelligentsia. These were mostly highly privileged nobles who felt this crushing sense of guilt that their entire lifestyle was funded by serfdom. Working for the state was completely unthinkable to them after watching the Decembrists get hanged. So to redeem themselves, they dedicated their lives to serving society, becoming writers, critics, doctors, and reformers, all obsessed with exposing Russia's deepest social sicknesses. But this new intelligentsia didn't agree on how to fix things. They quickly fractured into two totally warring ideological camps. On one side, you had the Slavophiles. They heavily romanticized the traditional peasant commune, calling it sobornost, a kind of spiritual union. They believed in this unique Christian Russian soul that was totally pure and untouched by Western selfishness. On the exact opposite side were the Westernizers. They argued that Russia didn't need more mysticism. What it desperately needed was European civilization, the Enlightenment, and most importantly, basic human rights. This whole tension completely blew up in 1847. The famous literary critic Vissarion Belinsky published his furious letter to Gogol. Belinsky just completely torches the mysticism argument. He writes that Russia doesn't need more sermons, it needs common sense, it needs actual justice, and it urgently needs to end the horrific practice of serfdom. This document was considered so incredibly dangerous by the state that just sitting in a room and reading it out loud got the legendary author Fyodor Dostoevsky arrested, subjected to a terrifying mock execution, and shipped off to a Siberian prison camp for 4 years. By 1848, the Tsar's paranoia had reached genuinely absurd levels. Out of sheer terror of a revolution, the state's preventative censorship committees were banning everything. They banned a new edition of Shakespeare's Richard III because they claimed it posed a moral danger. They literally banned reprints of letters written by their own former ruler, Catherine the Great. One censor even pointed out that, under the new, super strict rules, the Lord's Prayer could technically be interpreted as a subversive Jacobin speech. It sounds like a joke to us today, but it really shows how absolute and paralyzing the fear of reform had become. And the wildest part is, sometimes the system itself couldn't even take its own rules seriously. The raider Ivan Turgenev got arrested basically because his book, Sketches from a Hunter's Album, made serfs look a little too human. But while Turgenev was locked up, he actually got a visit from the chief of police himself. The guy brings a bottle of champagne, they have a few drinks, a nice little chat, and then the police chief ironically raises his glass and toasts to Robespierre. You know, the infamous radical French revolutionary. It just goes to show that even the men literally enforcing the autocracy fully recognized the bizarre, contradictory nightmare they were all living in. Section 5. The Policemen of Europe. Crushing the 1848 revolutions. Eventually, the Tsar's domestic paranoia spilled over the borders, especially when a huge wave of pro-democracy uprisings suddenly swept across the entire European continent in 1848. Revolts are erupting in Paris, Vienna, Berlin. For Nicholas, it's a nightmare coming true. He's seeing the ghosts of the French Revolution rising all over again. So he instantly mobilizes 400,000 troops to the western border. He was absolutely terrified that if these independent national states succeeded, it would spark copycat rebellions right in his own backyard, in places like Poland or Ukraine. So he didn't just sit and watch, he took action. Russian armies moved in, occupying Moldavia and sending nearly 200,000 troops to ruthlessly crush the democratic revolution happening in Hungary. From there, Russian foreign policy underwent a massive shift. It started out as a conservative effort to defend legitimate monarchs and keep the old European alliances intact. But it very quickly morphed into this mystical pan-Slavic mission to protect Orthodox Christians from the West. This came to a head over a dispute about who controlled the Holy Lands in Jerusalem. Was it the Catholics, backed by France, or the Orthodox, backed by Russia? Nicholas was entirely willing to go to war to defend what he truly believed was Russia's holy historical destiny against Western interference. There's a fascinating complaint from a Pan-Slav memorandum from that time that points out what they saw as blatant Western double standards. They argued, hey, France and England can go conquer colonies all over the globe with zero pushback, but the second Russia tries to protect its own neighbors, it gets condemned. Well, in the margins of that exact document, Tsar Nicholas I grabbed a pen and emphatically wrote, "We can expect nothing from the West but blind hatred and malice. This is the whole point." It's an incredibly potent summary of 19th century Russian autocracy, a mindset forged in the literal fires of Napoleon's invasion and hardened by decades of extreme ideological paranoia. And I think it leaves us with a really provocative question to wrap up on. How much does this historical narrative of grievance, this incredibly deep-seated fear of Western ideas, mirror the geopolitical rhetoric that we are still hearing today? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.